Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West, and deep apologies for the lateness. These things sometimes happen, sadly. And we're joined by the brilliant man behind the screen. I would say that this is an unexpected pleasure, but I think in some ways this is a long time coming, considering Dan, yourself, and I have kind of coordinated Warrior Wednesday and Sword and Saturday for quite some time now.
Yeah. So, yeah, pretty much from day one when you guys came up with Warrior Wednesday, and I misunderstood what you guys were talking about as a plan to switch it to Saturdays. And then we just decided, well, let's just make them both a thing.
Yeah. And, well, ever since then, we've kind of relied on you, and like a lot of ideas get bounced between in private messages and whatnot. And between yourself, Josh Tater, and even Harold Ember, in some ways, the four of us are kind of the four musketeers, or the five with Dan included. But let's just, without further ado, let's get to the juicy part the fans actually came here for. I'm going to ask the first question. What got you into writing?
Let's see. That is probably going to be the hardest question for me to answer because of the fact that has been a part of my life for 33 of my 37 years. I've pretty much been writing and scribbling down ideas since I was about 4. And I think what probably really started it was honestly my mom feeding into a childhood love of dinosaurs and paleontology, starting to show me old science fiction movies, beginning with the 55 Americanized version of Godzilla with Raymond Burr, which lit up my imagination. And then just a few months after that, by pure chance, I happened to see on TV late at night when I was just up late and my parents didn't know it, Vampire Hunter D was playing. And 4-year-old me watched that R-rated anime and was just like, this is so cool. I want to write stuff like this.
And now you do.
And now I do.
So, okay. And I believe you wrote an essay today about this, some of your journey to writing.
A little bit of it, yeah.
Yeah, I was reading it before we started. We've got already some comments. He read my Star Shatter draft. Ooh, okay. I didn't. Well,
so I actually met Black Knight, and I first met each other probably about close to 7 years ago now on Minds, back when I was running my YouTube channel, which was largely focused on tabletop games. Hence, why my little icon on Substack has a D20 in the middle of it. That's another aspect of where the love of fantasy and writing led me was, tabletop role-playing games. I've got a whole stack of tabletop role-playing games literally sitting on my desk to the left of me right here. Like 17 books.
Wow.
But pardon my ask, which ones?
Well, at the bottom of the stack, where they belong, the bottom of the totem pole, it's 5th edition. Mifrog, Dungeon Crawl Classics, the Savage Foes of Solomon Kane for Savage Worlds, Deadlands, the Savage World version, Whitechester, Prison City of the Damned, the Marshal's Handbook for Deadlands. Most of it's Deadlands, honestly. And then a few pieces of actual fiction sitting above it. A couple Common America comics, Uzumaki from Junji Ito, the Solomon Kane collection, and a couple of books from fellow Substackers, including Joseph Weiss's Voyage of the Dawnbreaker.
Ooh. All right. Good collection. We've got
Coyote the Fool is a very old friend of mine. I've known this guy for about 20 years.
Okay. No wonder he's checking you out. That is why he is hiding behind a screen. or the ladies will kidnap him.
I'll have to fight my wife.
Hide your husbands too. Okay. Twin Sons of Corolla wouldn't be the same without him, especially the end part.
So what he was referencing earlier is after we met on Minds, he was helping to kind of get me known around there, and I really do need to go back and use that site more. I'm just bad at social media. But
same.
When he was in the process of working on the second book in his series, by that point he had already known that I've been writing for a long time. I mean, like I said, I kind of started at 4, but when it really kicked in for me was in kind of middle school. 7th grade, 8th grade is when I started doing it a little bit more seriously. And then I started actively taking classes, trying to sort of learn the craft. And I started taking workshop style classes at the end of high school, going into, college for about 9 years. So I've had a lot of experience working with different forms of fiction, short fiction, long fiction, medium size, which is most of what I write now, novellas and novelettes, although, now I've basically got 2 novels going on via Substack, but also, studied a little poetry, stuff like that, which I was never very good at. But big thing those classes taught me was how to edit and how to critique people's works, which invaluable lesson for any writer to learn, in my opinion. And Black Knight already knew about this by this point, so he approached me to read over the last couple chapters of his second book, give him some suggestions and some edits, because there were some concerns. If I remember right, there were some concerns about the way that the book's central, establishing what was going to be the series' central villain towards the end of the story and how that was coming out. He wasn't really happy with how it was coming together. So I sort of went through it along with him and made some suggestions, suggested some alterations he could make. And, now here he is, I think 7 or 8 books into his 10-book main series. And, the central villain of it has become one of his most beloved characters. I think largely that's on him for having the good ideas, but, I had a little hand in that. I stuck a finger in the soup. Well,
yeah, and I can vouch for your skills as a, I don't know whether to say critic or book proofreader or whatever, because I remember when I wrote Darkspire, I missed out on typing up a section, and chapter 1 kept bothering me, and you put your finger exactly on where it needed fixing, and that vastly improved the overall chapter. So yeah, you're rightfully famous in our little club of writers as a great you have a great eye for it.
Which always throws me for such a loop, because it reminds me of something that I ran across years ago. Whenever I hear people say that, I don't remember the name of the guy, but it was the original head director of the God of War games when he released the first couple of games, and people started to recognize who he was and would praise him, and he's just like, really? I always just considered myself average. It just throws me every time I hear somebody say, like, oh, you're famous for this now. I am? Okay.
I get that. Well, to an extent, I get that. Dan and I do not have your eye for details like that, but I do understand where you're coming from. I'm going to ask you our second question. Mm-hmm. Why write?
Because it's just who I am. I think that, to give a better answer than, something kind of oddly pseudo-philosophical like that. I think part of what drove me to write when I was younger, once my imagination really got kicked off with all those old sci-fi and fantasy and horror movies, was the realization that I have a wildly overactive imagination. I've always got things running through my head constantly. Coyote's mom actually has a term for it that she uses that I like, monkey brain, where it just doesn't stop. You're like a hyperactive monkey. The mind just doesn't quiet. So at a certain point, I realized that when I was sort of just jotting these things down, it let me focus more. And so it kind of started in some ways, of course, leisure and enjoyment was part of it, but it also, I realized, was a useful tool in sort of focusing my attention, setting me on a, direct and proper course to work with something. Admittedly, though, it took a long time, many, many, many years for me to get to the point where I could maintain my focus long enough to properly finish something. For all the stuff I've got on Substack that I'm currently working on and that I have worked on and finished, I have probably 10 times as much stuff that I started, dropped, and never picked back up. They're across the years, across many computers and many hard drives that are now long since dead and destroyed because of how old they are, were probably a couple hundred started manuscripts that never really took off until I hit a stage in my life a couple of years back where I finally decided, enough is enough. You keep telling yourself you want to do this. It's time to sit down and actually do it.
So, next question. What got you into fantasy?
Now, that I did touch on in the essay a little bit. And the funny thing is that it was really seeing those movies as a little kid. I mean, when you're a little boy, I mean, you guys know, I know you guys have talked about this on your page before. When you're a young boy, you're always going to be drawn to tales of, knights and heroes and all that stuff. And the same was true with me. My older half brother helped with some of that, but being that he was already, only living with us half the time because it was from my dad's first marriage. So he was only with us half the time. By the time I was old enough to really remember his presence, he had already moved out. He was living on his own, going to college. So a lot of that stuff I kind of discovered on my own by chance. Partly, part of it was my mom showing me these old movies because she knew that I liked dinosaurs. So she'd see some monster movie with a dinosaur in it and show me that. And sometimes those movies were real fantastical. Other things was just stuff I happened to stumble across on TV. And some of it, frankly, was, golden age Disney animation, because we were very much a Disney household. So yeah, Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, which that one is still my favorite.
Yeah, those.
Yeah,
all that I grew up with. I remember golden age, the 1940s cartoon shorts of Donald, Goofy, and whatnot. That's what we grew up with, along with the Disney Renaissance stuff. Sorry, I misunderstood.
Yeah, exactly. It was the same sort of thing with me. Lots of classic Disney stuff, more modern Disney stuff, and then watching some of the Hanna-Barbera stuff as a kid. That sort of led into stumbling across things at school book fairs too, kids fantasy and in kids horror too. Goosebumps was a huge thing. Like, really, I was much more, as a kid, I was much more of an avid horror reader than I was a fantasy reader. The fantasy stuff really majorly kicked in, though. When that really swooped in and took everything over was in about 7th, 8th grade in the mid-90s. The very, very first time I ever played Dungeons and Dragons with my best friend's stepdad running the game for us. He was just teaching it because he got an early test edition of 3rd edition when that was being produced. So he got an early version of it about a year and a half before it was actually released in stores, because he had a friend, it was his ex-wife, ran a hobby shop up in the little mountain town we lived in. So she got early access to it. Wizards of the Coast was sending them out to different shops, and she heard about this and was like, hey, this is kind of like a thing that some of the kids around here like. I'm going to see if I can get one of these. And passed it over to him to test it out because he'd been playing since the 70s. So that kind of sparked it off, and from there, kind of the rest was history. Started learning more about the different books, read The Hobbit, read Lord of the Rings. Pretty typical from that point.
So I'm going to ask you a bit of a strange question. Why fantasy?
I think because on a deeper level, fantasy really speaks to an aspect of the human experience that everyone longs for. Everybody, no matter whether it's written in the form of fantasy or something more, for want of a better term, standardized, more normal or more modern, for want of a better phrase, everybody likes stories about heroes. Everybody likes stories about people overcoming difficult odds. Everybody likes stories of, human endurance, human endeavor, and human ability. And for all the fantastical elements within fantasy at their heart, I think that's what those stories largely are. Fantasy, more than any other genre, in my opinion, is about human endeavor and the human spirit. And through the trappings of dragons and monsters and knights and exotic locations, all those trappings can differ from author to author and story to story, but at the heart, even the bleakest fantasies are about someone trying to overcome through their ability, about the average person becoming a hero, or in some cases, the already heroic person becoming almost super heroic. And there's just something deeply meaningful about that, I think. Yeah, meaningful and beautiful about that, I think, for just about anybody.
So it's in a way a journey for hope.
Yes, I would say so.
I really like that answer. Black Knight also had a great answer. What is your favorite fantasy novel?
My favorite fantasy novel. Probably. Let me think here. Yeah, if we're talking specifically novels, it's probably The Hobbit still.
Good choice.
If we were talking something a little bit shorter, if we were talking more novella length, I'd have a different answer. But if we're specifically talking novels, then it would be The Hobbit.
Well, that'll be the next question then.
Favorite fantasy novella, I would say, is a tie between Queen of the Black Coast and The Fortress of the Pearl. So Howard's Conan story, Queen of the Black Coast, and Moorcock's Elric story, Fortress of the Black Pearl, or Fortress of the Pearl.
Okay. Queen of the Black Coast is a great read.
Yeah, that is absolutely fantastic.
I like Red Nails.
Red Nails is also very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I love the theological chat between Beilert and Conan.
Yeah. Really, that's why I kind of not the chat specifically, but the interplay, how Beilert and Conan interact with each other, is really kind of what pushes it just that little bit above Red Nails for me. The way Howard writes their interactions was fantastic. I love the way those two interact and the way their different worldviews both mesh in some ways and clash in others. which was something I really liked when you were kind of pointing that out in your guys' essay about the slaves that he rescues in Hour of the Dragon, his old crew. You know, you touch on the fact that like one of those fundamental differences between Belit and Conan is Belit tries to rule through fear. Conan leads through respect
and love.
Yes.
Yeah, because she like at the beginning of the Queen of the Black Coast, when her men are dying, she doesn't care. Whereas Conan, when he sees his men enslaved and broken, he's frothing at the mouth. He goes into berserk.
Yeah, he's so outraged. He goes totally berserk and butchers their captors.
Yeah, and it's such a great scene. Hour of the Dragon is probably the only novel that can compete with Lord of the Rings in some ways.
Yeah, Hour of the Dragon was very good.
Yeah. Favorite fantasy movie?
Favorite fantasy movie?
Yeah.
Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring.
Oh, okay.
The extended version.
Why?
Yeah. For as fantastic as the action in the other movies is, I love how well the character work is handled in the extended version of Fellowship, particularly when they're getting towards the latter quarter of the movie, and they start dropping those early seeds of the friendship with Legolas and Gimli, which is done through the request Gimli makes to Galadriel, requesting the single hair off her head for the parting gift. Just kind of the course that everyone is taking through that movie. I mean, you've got Boromir's fully encapsulated, story and growth, like as a character in that movie, is handled really, really well. The start of Frodo's journey, we start to see those early signs of how true Sam is to him. We see the early signs of Pippin and Merry maturing. Really, the one thing I wish we could have gotten in that movie also was a little bit of Theoden. That's the only thing for me that just wasn't there.
Mm. And that brings us to the next question. And I'm going to be trying here to offend as many people and upset as many as possible. That gets the views, that gets more popularity, I guess, online. Heaven only knows why. Why does the mainstream, or the lamestream as some call it, seem to utterly fail and not seem to understand fantasy at all?
I would take it a step further and say it's not just that they utterly fail and don't understand fantasy. They utterly fail and don't understand fiction.
Yeah.
There's an intrinsic misalignment of the goals there, in my opinion. Basically, story, good characters, taking a story, giving it some meaning through the action of the characters, actually presenting a story is no longer the goal for a lot of those people in that mainstream now. I think that a big part of it, in the case of quite a few of them, is pushing some ideological message. I think, honestly, though, a bigger part of it is just towing the current line because, hey, I'm getting a fat paycheck for doing this and I don't want to lose this gravy train. Whatever the reasons, though, there is a certain level of disingenuousness present in the way that the stories are written, the stories are presented, and really it's no longer about actually presenting a quality story. In the case of some of these IPs, it's people who I think deep down are bitter about the fact that they didn't come up with some of these ideas themselves and their own ideas were not successful, so they're actively seeking to destroy it. Star Wars. In the case of certain others, it's just a desperate attempt to maintain a bit of relevance and continue to make some rather undeserved money, in my opinion. But on the whole, yeah, I think it's largely a misalignment of goals versus what one is needed to write a strong, lasting, and meaningful story, and two, what the general public actually wants, which is a strong, lasting, meaningful story.
So now, the way you've worded things has gotten me thinking a little. Would you say they're motivated by hate,
Some of them.
greed, or jealousy?
I think it's a mix of them. And I think it's going to depend on each individual, of course, but in terms of the ones that are the most vocally against this stuff, like, I mean, it's kind of the in thing that everyone's talking about right now. Look at Leslie Headland in The Acolyte, for example. You know, reviews have been coming out last couple of days because the 4th episode just released, and everyone's talking about. Everyone was already talking about how the 3rd episode was a colossal trash fire, and seemingly ruined the Force. I don't really have an opinion on it. I'm not going to watch the show, so whatever. As far as I'm concerned, they already killed this. They already killed the franchise. This is just the final beatings of an already dead corpse. But the 4th episode, there's a whole lot of talk going on right now about the fact that, hey, we thought the last episode was a problem. This one actively broke Lucas's established lore. You've got the one character who in the Phantom Menace, Ki-Adi-Mundi, with his big knobbly head, who's talking about, hey, the Phantom Menace, he's dismissing Qui-Gon's idea that he could have run into a Sith on Tatooine because, hey, the Sith have been gone for 1,000 years. It's like, we would have heard about this.
Yeah, because the last one he wanted was Darth Bane.
Exactly. And yet now, all of a sudden, in this recent episode, a group of like 5 Jedi run into a Sith who just kicks the crap out of them. And so they work to investigate it. And who's in on the investigation? Oh, it's Ki-Adi-Mundi. And everyone knows it's him because they put his name in the credits. So they actively chose to select the one character that openly said they've been gone for 1,000 years and say, he was also there 100 years ago and was involved in the investigation where they found a Sith. You don't do that unless you are supremely incompetent, or you're actively trying to talk.
I had seen an interview. Now I don't really look up a lot of stuff, but this one was sent to me, and in it there was reference to Anakin destroying the Death Star, and it got me thinking. And now you confirmed something for me. Apparently, they've never actually seen the prequels or the originals.
No, they haven't. For the most part, they haven't, and they don't care to.
And they've never even read the novelizations.
Yeah, and that's therein is where you run into the problem. You get these people; they're being given the IPs. They are more than willing to take the work that was done before them, rip out whatever they want from it, and try to twist it into something and say, I did this. I mean, I don't want to harp too much on specifically the Acolyte because, this isn't a Star Wars stream, but it's the most recent example I can think of. When it came to the interviews with that, the lead up to the show, one of the things that was often quoted by people was, the showrunners talking about how, we tried to think about when we were working on this, how would George Lucas handle this? So why are you talking as if he's dead? The man is still alive. If you want to know how he would handle it, ask him. It's like this isn't the case of exactly. They don't want to. They don't care about the properties. They don't care about the fans of the properties. All they care about is stroking their egos, trying to make money, and trying to maintain some semblance of status that is completely undeserved because they cannot succeed with their own work.
And let's face it, we all know George has essentially been exiled from his own creations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, you quite fully answered that question. And when it comes to fantasy, it's interesting how the Black Knight commented about how this is a genre that speaks to the truth within human nature and belief
Mhm.
and the human spirit and just truth overall. But would you say that the mainstream media's attempts seem to be trying to buck against the truth, and so that's why it's failing?
Oh, I would definitely say that's what they're doing. You know, they're I mean, they're taking. I'm trying to find a way to phrase this that's not gonna that's not gonna go full scorched earth here, but basically, I think that's a fair way to put it. Is they're trying to buck kind of some established truths of human nature in many things, not just in terms of how they portray things in fiction. It's all a matter of basically trying to, and this is, I've been kind of paying attention to a lot of this stuff for a long time. I've had my ear to the ground for a lot of it, particularly back when I was running my own channel, because every now and then, at least where tabletop stuff was concerned, I talked about some of these issues. And just all these different subcultures, all these different hobbies, all these different things we do that are related to speculative fiction and genre fiction, they all interconnect in some ways. It's very, very easy to go from watching a couple videos about the latest scandal Wizards of the Coast pulled in the tabletop section to then be drawn into Star Wars because, hey, Wizards of the Coast made the Star Wars RPG years ago. Oh, so it drew me over into Star Wars, and then you get drawn over into the next movie or the next show or the next book, what have you. You can easily get towed down this line of the things that are going on, and you will see repeated patterns again and again and again. And one of the things that you see a lot of is that the people who are doing a lot of this stuff are open about the fact, they admit it, it's in their own words, that they are trying to change the public perception and the public view on certain ideas, certain ideologies, and certain beliefs. And they don't care whether or not they don't care whether or not it actually adheres to reality. The thing that matters to them is the control and the power. It's not about creating good stories. It's about sending a message. It's about the phrase the people on this side that are pulling this stuff always use. Everything is political. The personal is political. Everything is politics. They don't want anyone to escape from this. They don't want you to have your leisure time. They don't want you to have your chance to wind down and relax. They don't want you to have your fantasies, your stories, your genuine fictions that you can lean into, draw messages from, draw ideas from on your own. Because, hey, can't have you thinking for yourself. You got to think what we think.
Yep. So, for a slight change of topic, what would you say is the best medium for fantasy fiction?
I mean, I'm a bit biased, partly because it's the sort of stuff that I write, but I think, the novella, the novelette, like the old pulps, and of course, novels, I think those are the best. I think the written word, prose, and some poetry as well are the best ways for that, because you can get into the various levels of detail to really sparks the imaginations of the people reading it and get them viewing it in their own way, through their own head, through their own experiences. The way I put the words of my stories on the page, like whenever I eventually get out to finishing editing and physically publish in the Giant Shadow, for example, those words aren't going to change. The words themselves are going to stay the same, but how a reader pictures Geyer in her head, how they picture Jotungard, the town and the graveyard, how they picture the nightmare realm that she ends up traveling into, how they picture Reynold the Fox, how they hear his voice and her voice. Everyone's going to have a different view of that when you read it. Now, best in terms of reach, it would be movies. but best in terms of effectiveness and like, the deeper meaning, and in my opinion, the most entertaining way to get it is through books, through reading it.
Okay. So, how's about we get you to describe your world then?
Okay. So I've mentioned in passing a couple of times that, the greater world that my stories are set in, almost all of the ones I did, except for the couple on my page that are written in, what are pretty clearly supposed to be some facsimile of the real world, like a couple of the holiday ones I did, like the painter story I did for, I think, John Kuhn it was, and the Macabre Monday one I did about the creepy dinner. I'm blanking on what I called it, but most of them are set in my greater world, and it's all the same world. Claws of the Nulungu is a different part of the world from my stories with Geyer, is a different part of the world from the Castle on the Hill, but it's all the same world. Different nations, different cultures within it. And this is the setting, I call it Palinor. I've worked on it probably for about 15 years, all told. It's gone through many different iterations, many different names. I don't have it strictly written down anywhere. I mostly have some very key notes that I know about the different regions, which I kind of expand the more I write into them. And currently the one that's the most expansive, well, really the two that are the most expansive that I've written for our Substack are Dekand, which is the jungle where Claws of the Nulungu takes place. Its neighboring nation of New Bael, because both of those also feature in the webcomic I used to work on, Phoenix Rising. And then Stenais, which is the massive northern nation that most of Geyer's Wanderings currently are taking place in. Now, I have plans in future potentially with, and it all depends on how things kind of go. I'm a little bit, honestly, somewhat loosey-goosey as when it comes to my writing. I don't really do a whole lot of plotting, which is why I tend to write on the shorter side as opposed to long form. But I have a lot of ideas for ways in which she can start traveling the greater world to start experiencing some of these different areas. But yeah, I've got cultures down. I've got nations down. I've got the ways these different peoples interact, why they interact the way they do at certain periods of time, who was the greatest power, pre-calamity, because of course there's a calamity. Why would I call it Tales of Calamity and Triumph otherwise? Who was the greatest power post-calamity, what trade is like, what nations value different things, so on and so forth. It's really a pretty broad hodgepodge of different ideas that I picked from over time. And a lot of them were ideas I worked on with the artist that I worked on Phoenix Rising with. Her name is Hair Illustrations. And she and I worked on that comic for about, before we worked on it for about 2 years before we started publishing it on Webtoon. And then for another about 4.5 years after that, before her work schedule changed and she was no longer able to continue drawing for it. The hope is to one day go back and at least finish the first arc that we were doing, but it always to be seen. We all know what it's like. We all know what it's like when the work situation changes and how much time that can eat. Yeah. And then she lives in England. She's got to commute an hour by train into and out of London every day for her job. So, it's a lot of her time gets eaten up nowadays. But really the key thing with the way I built this setting is that I developed these different regions to be able to write different types of stories in them. And there are bigger stories that will encapsulate the different regions, but each of them originally existed to basically support a single story that I started writing, however odd many years ago, most of these stories, like I mentioned at the start of the stream, they didn't fully take off. They never fully got finished. They never really went anywhere, and they sort of fell by the wayside until the last couple of years when I really started digging in and going again. But I can say, at least in terms of more specifics in regards to really, Dekand is probably the one place that is, even though I have written most of my stuff in Stenized, Dekand, the jungle, is the place that is the most well realized, in that what you see of the culture of Wide-Eye and Blackpaw, how they interact with the captain and the woman who crashed from the airship, and the way they kind of live and fight and survive in that primordial jungle is really like, that story fully encapsulates what that particular setting is. Like you guys had said in your article about the 5 Substack writers, it's very Tarzan-like. It's got inspiration from Conan. Honestly, its most direct inspiration was itself took direct inspiration from Conan, and that was Genndy Tartakovsky's Primal. But yeah, that whole thing of a primordial land that is full, a mixture of prehistoric and modern age animals, prehistoric cultures, all of this sort of stuff. This jungle literally exists in a valley in the middle of a massive desert, because it's one of the very few places left in the world where true, raw magic still exists. Everything about that jungle is infused with magic and the energy of life and all of that sort of stuff. Dekand is the single most magical place in a very literal way in my setting, because it was the one place left in the world that, when the old power that was established fell, I mentioned how the neighboring nation in Phoenix Rising to the jungle is New Bael. Well, New Bael is the remnants of an old mage empire. It was very much inspired by ancient Persia, ancient Egypt, lots of Middle Eastern cultures. And then a little bit of Roman thrown in there. A lot of inspiration from ancient world cultures went into this. Well, this culture firmly believed that magical aptitude meant a right to rule and meant that you were a superior individual. If you had the ability to learn, or better yet, were born with the natural ability to use magic, by their laws, you had the right to rule. Which, when you already have an established ruling caste, an established ruling body, a pharaoh with a council, all of whom are mages, and you start finding common folk who are being born with this, that creates a problem for you, because you want to maintain your power. So moves were taken, organizations were disappearing people, and slowly but surely unrest began to form in this empire. Unrest that was then taken advantage of by ancient enemies that are straight up a direct pull from Howard. It's snake people. You got to have snake people.
Oh yeah, I've got them in some of my stories.
Yeah, their oldest. The empire was originally formed.
Just a comment.
The Serpent Folk Empire.
Yeah,
so,
I'm just going to comment real quick. It's interesting how it used to be orcs that were the, puppets of evil and this sort of thing. But since kind of Warcraft redeemed the idea of orcs and turned them into, a kind of, I don't want to say alliance, but like heroic race, it's now snake people that are returned as the ultimate evil race of sorts.
Yeah.
But
so in this particular case, basically the Baelan Empire was built in the ruins of an old, serpent folk empire that had been largely wiped out. And I'll touch a little bit more on that in a bit. There's a few remnants of them. They've got their own ancient gods and stuff, and very destructive, slaving. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I'm doing anything original with the snake people. If you've seen evil snake people in something, you've seen mine. Well, they orchestrated a way to kind of try to usurp control over this land back for themselves. And in the midst of massive civil unrest, they made their move. And in so doing, they ended up miscalculating and led to a calamity that not only completely wiped this empire off the map, it had its own little, like almost Australia-style subcontinent off the coast of the main continent that most of my stories take place in, a crescent-shaped continent that the mages of this civilization, they shaped the land into a crescent moon shape themselves to just as a show of their superiority. They literally shaped their own island from its natural shape to look like a crescent moon. So they're doing all kinds of crazy stuff with magic, which is throwing things all out of balance. And then when these snake people make their move, try to do their thing to sort of, wipe out the main city, it goes way bigger than it should have. And it literally scours a massive portion of the world and desertifies a massive portion in the world, including all the lands around Dakand. Dakand was a place of such concentrated, pure magical energy that when this happened, it was really the one place that couldn't be affected by it because it was so pure and so dense that all the other energies just rolled right over it. They couldn't even touch it. It was completely repelled. Because of that, though, no modern civilization has been able to go in there. They haven't been able to terraform it. They haven't been able to push the jungle back. Anytime anybody tries, they basically end up dead. The jungle itself will take them. Like the roots will grab them and pull them underground, kind of like the trees in Fangorn try to do to Merry and Pippin. So, yeah, it's a pretty wild place. Yes, hello. I'm joined by a co-host. She's very whiny.
Our co-host is downstairs resting.
Yes, Asami is being very demanding.
Does she feature in any stories?
Say hello. She features in this one now. Yeah. Actually, it is funny. She technically does feature in the webcomic because in one of the early releases we did, my artist had this idea to draw a little scene of when one of the people that's pursuing the main cast finds them and is going back to report his findings to the main group of villains in the first major story arc. He's running through the jungle, and you see this jungle cat who's like crouched down, ready to pounce on a little mouse, and then both animals go running when he runs past them. She based the cat off of my cat, so technically, yes, she is in one of my stories.
Well, okay. I can tell you can. You love your world.
Yeah. Something I've been working on for a long time.
So I'm going to try asking I'm going to ask a more focused question on you. What would be your favorite RPG system?
Savage Worlds.
Okay.
So, I got my start with D&D, like I had said, with 3rd edition. Played that into 3.5, into Pathfinder. After doing Pathfinder for a number of years, played with a couple friends at work, and Coyote, who's in the chat here. And we went to one of my coworkers' places, and because he invited me to join in a long-running game of his, a long-running 2nd edition game of his. And I asked him, like, hey, I got a really good friend of mine who also loves these games. Would you mind another player? He's like, yeah, sure. So we did that for a few years. And then in the interim, I'm trying other games too. Star Wars D20, Call of Cthulhu, Trail of Cthulhu, all a bunch of other ones that I don't even fully remember that I would try once or twice. And one particular year, I go up to where Kui lives, and we go visit a mutual friend of ours called Moose. We really, his granddad nicknamed him Moose as a way of kind of mocking him, but he sort of took it and just made it his own thing. And
As he should.
yeah, he invited us over at one point to give Savage Worlds a try. Told us, like, hey, one of his friends got this new game. I played it a little bit. It's pretty cool. We should give it a try. And I really enjoyed the way that the system itself ran. How everything you don't have your typical 6 stats like you do in D&D, that you get certain levels, which then gives you modifiers. You add them to your rolls. No, each of your stats is itself a dice. And then when you roll the stat, you roll whatever die for it is marked off on your character sheet. So it takes a little getting used to, but once you do, it makes things move pretty quick. But the thing I really loved about it is the way it's meant to be a universalist system. You can run it with just about any type of setting. I mentioned when I was talking about my stack of books here, how I have the game Deadlands and a Solomon Kane game. Both of those use Savage Worlds as its system. So I could literally, this weekend, if I wanted to, gather some people up and play a Solomon Kane tabletop game because I have the book now. Savage Worlds, because of how they run things, you can just use it in just about any type of setting that you want. It works for some better than others, but superheroes, sci-fi space travel, Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, Deadlands, which is Weird West, Solomon Kane, Conan, all that stuff. It can work with any of it, potentially. And just opens up a lot of room for creativity once you start getting it down, once you kind of start getting the system down.
Okay. So when it comes to tabletop RPG systems, just to briefly move away from fantasy, what's your favorite science fiction one?
Favorite science fiction one is, let's see, I played a lot less of those than the other ones. Not the latest version of it, but I think it was the 3rd version of the Star Wars system for the D20 system. I really enjoyed that one.
Saga editions?
Was Saga the 3rd one?
I can't
I
remember.
thought Saga was the 4th. I can't recall. It was the one, Saga was the one I played the most, but it was the one before Saga that I really liked. It was a little bit crunchier, but what I particularly enjoyed about that one is it didn't quite have that same issue of power creep that Saga did, because when you're creeping up in power, you're using all the same stuff in that player's handbook for all your enemies too. So there was never a point playing that older version where I felt like I was starting to dominate, where players were starting to dominate everything just by virtue of being the players and having what they had, because the enemies often had a lot of the same stuff. And I love it. I love playing tabletop games that have that extra bit of challenge in them. And where the sci-fi stuff was concerned, because most of my friends, we didn't really play that much in the way of sci-fi games. And one I've wanted to try, and I think I would really like, but I've never been able to actually find a group to play it, was Cyberpunk 2020. Never found a group for it, though. So I can't really say it because I've never actually had the chance to play it, even though I've got the books. But yeah, for the ones I played, I think it was like Star Wars D20 second edition. If Saga was the third edition, then it was the second edition. That was the one I really liked.
Okay. So, which writer would you say had the most influence over you as a fantasy writer?
Oh, there's quite a few, but recently I would have to say it's probably Michael Moorcock. Unfortunate last name that he has. When I finally got the chance to, I'd already read quite a few years ago the comic, the bande dessinée adaptations of many of the Elric stories, particularly Stormbringer, Ruby Throne, and I still haven't gotten the third one in that set yet. I still need to get a hand of that. But I read a couple of the other ones online as well. And, I'm like my essay I wrote today said, I love dark fantasy, particularly when it's handled really well. I love dark fantasy. When it's handled poorly, it can be absolutely atrocious, but when it's handled well, and I personally do think Moorcock handled it very well, I find it very enjoyable. And the Elric stories really kind of hooked me in. I particularly because I ended up liking how, even though Elric is a very troubled person, he's got a lot of bitterness, a lot of dourness. He's prone to depression, which really shows in the second omnibus, because that was when Moorcock was depressed, and that shows in his writing. Even despite that, he still strives to try to be a good man. He tries to go against the baser, more wicked nature of his Melniboné blood and tries to be a decent person. There are many times where he fails and says that he can't. But I always love those stories of somebody who struggles with that sort of thing, but they're still going to put in the effort. Okay. That mixed then with Moorcock's imaginativeness. Before I read the Elric stories, I'd read and experienced lots of dark fantasy stuff. I already mentioned Vampire Hunter D, which is, basically vampiric future Japanese Solomon Kane. Obviously, of course, there's also Solomon Kane and, other contemporaries like that. None of them had the same level of imaginativeness that Moorcock brought to his stuff. I mentioned The Fortress of the Pearl as being my favorite story of his earlier, and that one is real close for me with another one of his stories, The Revenge of the Rose, which is the story where he introduces the main repeat villain in the Elric saga, which is Gaynor the Damned. And in both of those stories, he has a very imaginative approach, a very fantastical approach to the settings he's presenting and the world building and the mechanics of his world that feels like it really digs into that otherworldliness that you get in a lot of high fantasy, that focus on the fantastical side of thing that happens in a lot of high fantasy. And he blends it really expertly with the darker stuff. And that was a big inspiration for me when I finally started to really sit back down and properly write and start finishing these stories in the last couple of years. The stories I've been sharing to my Substack, I've been trying to kind of capture a little bit of that more when I go into the fantastical side of things, to kind of balance this more human experience, this more normal, not so much necessarily real world experience, but real feeling experience of like this Viking like setting that this Scandinavian like setting that Geyer's stories are set in, and balance that with the fantastical side of it by really making the fantastical side of it feel fantastical and mystical in a way similar to how he did with his writing. It was the first time, probably the first time since reading Tolkien when I was young, that I read fantasy stories where I was like, this feels like I'm reading something that feels new. Never mind the fact that he wrote these stories in the 70s and 80s. I mean, they're 40 to 50 years old by now, but they felt new. They didn't feel like, particularly for all the different stories out there that pull from Elric, that pull from the archetype of the pale-skinned monster hunter with a magic sword, or the pale-skinned like fallen hero with a magic sword. The world that Moorcock sets his stories in, particularly when you get into the few first-person books he does, where you're exploring Elric's, they call it the 1,000-Year Dream, which is basically during it was, I believe, originally the only novel that he wrote for Elric until he wrote, I think it was the 4,000-Year Dream novels. In the Stormbringer novel, I believe it was Stormbringer, Elric nearly dies before he can even complete his quest. And he starts to rely on ancient Melnibonéan sorcery to find a way to overcome this rival emperor who's basically working with the Lords of Chaos to wipe out the world and establish himself as, the god of the particular world that the story is set in. Part of the 1,000-Year Dream spell is that Elric's soul travels into Moorcock's version of the multiverse and starts searching out the different universes within the multiverse for his reflections, so that he can seek out all the various reflections of Stormbringer, bring them together, and finally banish the Lords of Law and Chaos from existence to create balance in the world. All of those stories are set in part in the real world, in our world, in different eras. The first one is World War II Germany. The second one is, I think, the 1950s northern Midwest United States along the border of the US and Canada. The third one was the one I remembered the least, because I think there was only three. The third one takes place in the 1980s, following the grandchild of the living reflection in our world of Elric instead. And three different eras of our world that are then also bouncing into other worlds completely different from ours. All of them very different in how they work, very different in how they function, very imaginative, but with the same core group of people that has experienced these prior experiences and are able to then build off what they've learned before. I had never seen to that point anybody create a multiverse that, for one, felt as properly connected as he had, and for two, felt like it had actual stakes. That was a big thing for me with that. Unlike Marvel with all the multiverse stuff they're doing now, where it's like none of it feels like it matters because, Kang the Conqueror died in Ant-Man. Well, we've got literally infinite other Kang the Conquerors that exist that can come back to become the main big bad guy now, at least until that guy got kicked out from his beating his wife scandal or whatever it was. But with Moorcock, there were elements, cosmic forces within his settings that were constantly constantly threatening to pick apart and unravel the threads that held the multiverse together. All of existence was threatened constantly, and yet, despite the overwhelming, like beyond human comprehension level stakes, you still felt the stakes because he kept the story on the human level. And that, for me, was something I hadn't seen a lot of fantasy writers do too successfully. And I've not seen a lot of fantasy writers do it as imaginatively as he did. So that was a massive inspiration for me in the last couple of years. Before that, otherwise, largely Howard in a big way. More so Solomon Kane than Conan, but
Solomon
really both.
Solomon Kane is awesome.
Oh, I love Solomon Kane.
The 2009 movie is, oh my gosh, it's so good.
That was a very fun movie. I very much enjoyed watching that when I watched it a few years ago.
Yeah, it's now become the movie when I'm sick or have a I have a fever and I can't really think. I just flick that on. Have to flick it on. Okay. Now I asked this of the Black Knight. Now I'll ask of you. Who is your favorite, or like this could be a group of them, Substack writers or Substack writer?
There is a handful of them that play very closely to each other. Yourselves are among them. The way you guys handle that classic fantasy feel, that Tolkienian fantasy feel, where it reads like myth and legend. Darkspire was one that I was very much enjoying. Calabolg, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right because I know it's Celtic and I'm terrible at pronouncing Celtic. But Braden's story, I loved sinking my teeth into his story. That one hooked me. Yeah, that one was wonderful. And so yourselves, I would consider among them. Lately with fantasy, although disappointingly she hasn't been able to write as much because of work, but the Chronicler is somebody, Maya, the Chronicler is somebody that I very quickly grew to enjoy. Obviously Josh Tatter. But the first two other writers on there that I met that I really, well, actually the first three other writers on there when I was first starting out that I met, whose work I really synced with, and disappointingly one of them is no longer there. But Harold Ember was the first of them. And I with even the small reach I had, I did everything I could to get eyes on his work, because I really feel like he has this fantastic grasp of fairy tale fantasy.
Oh, he does.
The kind of fantasy that you look at and you just know, like, when I have kids, I can read them these stories and it will spark their imaginations. And these are good stories for families. Adults and children can share them together. And that's something that not a lot of people, not a lot of writers really go for. And I don't know if that's something he actively went for, but it was something he hit on, and he hit on really well. Joseph Weiss was the next one.
He's brilliant.
At the time he was working on A Reeve's Tale. So I started in with that, and now he's putting up the early portions of his published book novella, The Voyage of the Dawn Trail, or Dawn Trader, excuse me. Dawn Trail. Freudian slips, because Dawn Trail, Final Fantasy 14 Dawn Trail is coming out in 2 weeks, so I got it on the brain. But the other one, who sadly is not on Substack anymore, but who I am still talking to, and I am still working on him to help him proofread and edit his work, was Sybil. You know, her verse, and he has a grasp of character-focused fantasy that among our contemporaries that are and were over on Substack is unparalleled. Like, his understanding of how to present real feeling human relationships in a way that doesn't lean into that provides conflict without leaning into a lot of the toxicity and the negative tropes and negative aspects that we see in so much stuff currently that really is just like oversaturating a lot of things now. It's sublime. Just absolutely fantastic. And I'm very happy to say that he's been the one who's been the primary beta reader for In the Giant Shadow. So he's been a huge help with me getting that ready to be to eventually be physically published, which I hope I can do this year.
Cool. Well, okay. I want to ask another question, but my brain is fizzled out because I'm going to be honest. Big fan of yours, and I did blush to hear you say you liked Caliburn and Darkspire. So that's fizzled my brain out a little. I'm not trying to be vain. It's just
oh, that's all right.
It never occurred to me because I don't know if this is what it's like with you, but when you read your own work, it doesn't speak to you in the same way that it might to someone else.
No, it doesn't. We are always going to be our own harshest critics.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Mm-hmm.
But I will be honest, yourself, Josh Tater, Harold, and you guys shine to me.
There is one more name I need to add to the list too. Catherine Elaine.
She's brilliant. She's like she's a female version of Howard. I will go to my grave. She's brilliant.
No, she has a fantastic grasp of her characters. She has a fantastic grasp of, not to sound like it's weak repetition, but a fantastic grasp of fantastical storytelling. Yes. She knows how to present the feel of fantasy. And it's really amazing to me, the concepts, the ideas that she plays with, and how well she plays with these ideas, considering how new a writer she is, that she's only been doing this for 1 or 2 years.
Really? Never.
Yeah, no, I spoke with her about this. This stuff is a very, very recent thing for her. She's always been artistically inclined, but her original artistic inclinations was painting.
Yeah.
And then I can't recall why it was that she said she started writing, but she and I talked about this in private messages on Substack. And yeah, this is still a fairly new thing to her within the last couple of years that she started really digging in and doing this. And she's a natural, it's like
she is
with the right guidance. Once she can kind of get the technical stuff down, and I mean, that's really all that's really the main thing that needs to happen is when she starts getting the technical stuff down, it's going to be tough. English is the second language for her. It's not her primary language, but when she does get those technicals down, the weird idiosyncrasies of English and gets a firmer grasp on them, which she's getting a better grasp of it with each story she releases. So it's going to happen sooner than she thinks, I'm pretty sure. But once those are gotten down and she starts getting a better idea of all the technical side of things, she's going to be set. She'll be able to go through any cleanup that her stories need doing. She can knock that out, self-publish that stuff, and she will. I am very confident she will have a fan base over from her readers on Substack. She's going to have a large chunk of that fan base who are going to eat up her books if she decides to start publishing them, which it seems like she's really considering now.
Yeah. And who could blame her? I'll say this about her. She's been having troubles with TradPub. I myself have encountered the same problems. And it's their loss where she's concerned.
Yeah.
My own problems have led me to just become utterly disillusioned with TradPub.
I was disillusioned with them back when I was even still in college, because I knew the types of stories that I liked to write, were not the kind of stories that traditional publishing looks to publish. Even back then, this was back in 2007, 2008 to about 2013 or so.
Yeah. I'll actually
Yeah,
just interject and say they wouldn't even publish you. I mean, no offense here.
No, I know.
You write a lot of stuff like that's Howardian. They would not publish Howard.
No.
Most part in the 1920s and 30s. So they wouldn't publish you even back then. They wouldn't publish Catherine back then. It's their lives. They're not very smart.
No, yeah, I mean, that's why it's all about, on our end, it's all about basically making our own connection, kind of making our own market.
Hmm.
Yeah. Which is challenging.
Yeah. What advice would you give for in terms of publication and marketing and such?
I honestly, at this point, I'm not far enough in the process to really say. Because In the Giant Shadow is going to be, so technically it's not going to be my first published story. But I don't really count it because the one I got published before was published specifically as part of a collection of creative writings selected by the professors at the community college I was studying from. So I technically have had a story published, but it was very much a very particular kind of case. It wasn't anything I got paid for. It wasn't anything that was published on a big scale. It was a very unique individual case. So in terms of the self-publishing side of it, I'm kind of learning a lot of this stuff as I go. So I'm not really at the point that I have clear advice yet. But if I had to give one piece of advice, I would say make sure, go in, revise your work, edit your work, read it back to front, edit it from the last chapter to the first, and then go over it with at least one more pass, making sure that you're letting other people whose ability you trust read it and give you suggestions. You cannot hide behind being scared to share your early work with somebody who will help you edit it. If you cannot handle sharing it with somebody that you can trust to help you edit it, you are never going to be able to handle criticism from the public.
No.
You have to learn. We all have to learn how to accept criticism from people who want to help us. Otherwise, it's going to be impossible. Inevitably, you'll run into people that don't like your stuff.
Yeah.
Haters are going to hate, but it's a lot harder to handle that stuff if you can't even handle the people that want to help you giving you critique. And I say this from the perspective of somebody who learned how to do this stuff in school, because like I mentioned, when I was in school, the classes I took were not like, here's how to write. This is how you write a paragraph. This is how you structure a story. This is how you do this. They let us have a lot of freedom in how we approach that stuff. The idea was to learn the workshopping process, the critiquing, the editing, the revision. That's really what we learned in those classes.
That sounds like a great set of classes.
It was very good. Honestly, I think it was better than what the universities locally offered. Like this was a junior college. It was a community college. That's like 10 miles from my home. And I think their writing program is better than what the universities offer, because the universities are were more of a traditional writing program where they're trying to teach you, like, you know, this is how you do this. This is how you do that. This is what's acceptable, you know, as opposed to letting you flex your creative muscles, looking at your goal with the story as a writer, and then helping you to recognize, like, how can I achieve this goal better? What flaws, what errors am I making that are holding me back? You know, learning to critique other people's work is great for learning to critique your own. But you got to learn how to accept critique. I would say that's probably the biggest thing, because the last thing you want to do is publish an early draft work that isn't finished, because if you like, you got a little I would say you probably have leeway with the first book. You know, If you're new, audiences are going to forgive that a little bit. I think it's sort of similar to touch on another major that I took, which was my original goal when I went to college, video game design. It's like a designer publishing their first game. The audiences, fans who like them, they're going to forgive a certain amount of errors. But if those errors keep showing up time after time after time, that forgiveness is going to fade fast. So learn how to take criticism, learn how to take critique, learn how to edit, and be willing to put in that work. Because particularly if we really want to make this independent side of things feel legitimate, we need to be able to put stuff out there that is of high quality, that has a good benchmark, that can compete with the quality level that people think of. If not necessarily true nowadays, but it's the quality level people think of when you think of mainstream publishing.
Agreed.
I guess I had some advice after all.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason why Dan and I tend to say, especially when, like you receive criticism, sometimes I think everyone I've met who writes has had a thin-skinned moment where it's like, well, they say to themselves, he doesn't get it. But then they take, like what Dan and I do is we take like a full day away from it, and then we come back and we say, we reread the work, and usually we then go, the guy was right. But we tend to say, and constantly tell ourselves and each other, criticism is love. And we just keep repeating that mantra, and eventually we start thinking of the criticism as a, like, well, this guy gets it better than I do. I gotta come back in. I gotta fix it. Like,
it's absolutely true. And you will. It can be hard to tell the difference at first, but with time and with experience, particularly depending on how it's couched too. Some people are real bad about how they deliver criticism. It's important to learn how to deliver it too. Like when I presented the critiques for Darkspire, I made sure to point at what I liked, what I thought worked first and foremost. Start positive, and then point at, hey, I noticed this. This is an issue. You've got to be polite about it, and you've got to understand the person you're talking to a degree too.
And when you pointed that stuff out, I did reply like, the section you were like, I'm not sure about this section. I remember I had been looking it over before, like a few days before you had looked at it, and I went, there's something I'm not seeing, but it's not working for me. And then you pointed out the exact section. I remember going, my immediate reaction was, that was the section. I need to fix that. And I had already been trying to figure out what to fix, but I didn't know the exact section. And then, I whipped up the repair work and asked you, okay, how does it look now? And man, that was, I really liked that.
Funny thing, actually, funny thing happened. This just goes to show that, like, I've admitted before the drafts I put up there are like, first, second drafts on my Substack. I am the type of, kind of very sort of perfectionist writer that like wants to get the details as close to right as I can the first time through.
Yeah.
And, that was for a long time a big reason why I struggled so much to actually finish something. Now I'm so practiced that it's like, it's just second nature. But the first chapter, when I started writing The Jarl's Son, when I wrote the opening scenes for it, the opening few pages, I wrote those probably about 3 months before I wrote the rest of chapter 1, because I had the idea in my head. I wanted to get it down. I wrote it down. I knew how I wanted to present it. I knew the feel that I wanted to get. And as I wrote it and read it back to myself, it clicked. I'm like, this isn't right. Something about this isn't working. The feel isn't coming through, but I can't see why. I sent it off to another friend of mine who writes. Literally within 2 minutes, he was back to me. He's like, oh, well, you wanted this feel? You need to do this, 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 and this. The way you're writing it is for a completely different feel, and that's why it feels wrong. You've got language and tone that are saying one thing and imagery that's saying another. I was like, that's it. Went back, rewrote the entire thing, and it worked infinitely better.
Okay. Sorry, just I'm only muting every once in a while because it's overwhelmingly hot out here. So I'm flicking the AC on every once in a while.
That's all right. I've got a fan on me right now, pointed slightly away so it doesn't hit my microphone.
Yeah, ours is so loud you won't hear anything but that. All right. Now, which of your work in particular? I'm kind of playing this question improv style, but I'm very curious. Which of your work would you most want to see? Let's say if you had like 50 million bucks or whatever, how much it takes, would you want to see as a movie or something? If you'd want to have one seen as a movie or TV series at all.
I have an answer that comes to me on instinct, and there's a particular reason why, with that question, it's the instinctual answer, and it's the webcomic Phoenix Rising, and the reason why that comes to me just immediately as like the instinct answer is because that's something that my artist and I talked about a lot. That's something she loved to fantasize about. She loved, particularly because one of our big inspirations when we were writing that, when we were working on that, was Avatar: The Last Airbender. She and I adore that show. Fantastic, fantastic show. But, it naturally led to her in particular, fantasizing a lot about like, oh, it'd be so cool if we were able to get this made into an animated series and stuff. So like, that's always the one that jumps to mind out of habit more than anything. But I think if I was to say, okay, so there's a funny reason for this answer. The one I would really want to see, if it were up to me, would be The Demon from Beyond the Stars, the first novella that I put up on Substack. The very first thing I put up there. And the reason is honestly kind of spiteful.
Why?
So I wrote that story. I came up with the idea for that story December of 2022-ish, I think. Maybe January of 2023, somewhere around there. Might have even actually been even a little earlier than that. Could have been as far back as November of 22. My wife and I had just watched a movie in one of my favorite franchises. I had earlier in the summer, for the first time together, we had watched the first Predator, and then we watched Predator 2. She had seen a couple of the other Predator movies, like Predators, the one by I literally just had his name in my head and I forgot it. Rodriguez, Tarantino's friend, Rodriguez. I'm blanking on his name, but that was the one from a few years back with where it took place on another planet, and you had like the giant predators and the little predators, and it was pretty dumb. But I've always liked the Predator as a monster. So a while back, because we had heard some decent things about it, and I was like, okay, I've heard okay things about Prey. I want to see it. And I was so disappointed. I was so disappointed with that movie. First portion of it, the Predator felt like a classic take on the Predator. Wasn't the biggest fan of the main girl. She wasn't bad. She was just kind of okay. I liked her brother well enough too, but I always felt like there was a story there that could have been really fantastic and handled really, really well that was missed solely for the sake of giving this girl her badass moment at the end of the movie. The whole movie felt like it was really setting up towards this story of not just her being accepted by her tribe as somebody who was capable as, a hunter and somebody who could help the boys with that stuff. But it felt like it was building to a story where her brother, who was the tribe's best hunter, she and her brother would understand each other better and start to and see that their individual strengths could make up for each other's individual weaknesses. And I had hoped that's where the story was going. And that's not where it went. He ends up dying. She gets her typical girl boss moment. This tiny little 110-pound girl ends up through acrobat combat, wire fighting, and all this stuff, and laying of very simple traps that this predator was an idiot not to figure out. Ends up beating this thing's ass worse than Arnold Schwarzenegger did in the original one in the 80s.
Of course she did.
Yeah. And it was just real disappointing to see that movie that seemed to have so much promise take the route that it did. And I kind of got this bug in my head of I bet I could write a story like this better. And that's why I wrote The Demon from Beyond the Stars. That's also why I'm never going to actually physically publish it, because technically it is a stolen property, even though I never call the predator the predator. But in that story, Geyer and the other characters in that story deal with a predator. And I tried very hard to capture the way the predator feels in the original movie, where it's stalking worthy prey. It's only going after things that it feels are worth its time and worthwhile. And I wasn't necessarily super confident that I had achieved that, because I had never attempted to do something like that before. I had written, in the past when I was much younger, I'd written fan fiction and played around with ideas from other intellectual properties, writing stories within their settings, but I had never done something like this where I'm actually taking an established character from one of those properties and trying to faithfully adhere to it. So I took a lot of care in how I approached it, and fortunately people who did read it after the fact had told me, including Joseph Weiss actually, had told me that they felt that I was very successful at that I had successfully captured that feeling and made it feel like there were genuine stakes. The predator didn't feel like it was making stupid decisions for the sake of the plot. The characters didn't feel like they were making stupid decisions for the sake of the plot, and that it felt suitably, thrilling and intense. So for kind of spiteful reasons, I wouldn't mind seeing that one made into a movie.
Well, I wouldn't mind, out of spite, seeing that meme that's floating on Twitter of a Sanada Hiroyuki samurai movie where he fights a predator as a samurai.
Yeah.
I think we all want to see that. But
of course, that goes without saying.
Well, I think we're kind of veering towards the end of this show, although it would be great to down the road get you back on.
I'd love to.
I think we'd both love to hear on our end. So I never know quite how to end a show, so I'll just ask you to plug your work some more and
Sure.
And say any last parting words you want to say.
Yeah. So for those of you just joining who aren't aware, I am the man behind the screen. Greetings and salutations, writers and readers of all stripes, sort of the pulps, largely inspired by Howard, Michael Moorcock, and lately even a little bit of Fritz Lieber. I've been reading on the Lord Otter's suggestion. I've been reading Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, which is fantastic. I love those stories so far. Very fun. Currently, I am working on 2 serialized projects over on Substack. The Jarl's Son, which is the 4th story that follows the character of Geyer the Valdunite. That is Valdunite. I need to pronounce this properly, because when I was on the stream with the Terran Tuesday stream with the Black Knight a couple of weeks ago, somebody thought I said Vulvanite. I don't know what a Vulvanite is, but it ain't Geyer. So
Oops.
those stories have a lot of kind of more of a low to medium fantasy feel, very much Scandinavian styled, lots of mysticism, shamanism, and witchcraft involved with that, where the magic is concerned, and lots of playing around with the idea of dreams. Other than that, I've also got a more traditional fantasy story going on with The Castle on the Hill, which is kind of a coming of age young fantasy romance with a bit of mystery sprinkled in. But I've got multiple stories, essays, a couple poems, plenty of options up there available for reading. 2 full novellas that are largely complete in The Demon from Beyond the Stars and In the Giant Shadow, a novelette that takes place between them called The Storm's Child, a handful of short stories, and plans to continue with quite a bit more, and hopefully one day get some of these published physically. And you can find all of this, by the way, on Substack, Tales of Calamity and Triumph.substack.com, and I will drop a link in the description.
Yeah, well, we did put it in the description, I believe.
Well,
It's about the only
then
thing
all is done.
we put it down there because this stream was, and when this gets republished of sorts over on Storyfire Substack, the only thing that will hopefully be in the description will be your link, because this is about you and your work, which we were honestly like just over the moon that you accepted this, and this has actually been a blast to listen to you talk about your world. I cannot wait to read both Castle on the Hill and Jarlson, which I will have more time to do. Well, my days are getting a little less busy soon, so that's where I'm hoping to spend some time just perusing your various epics.
I hope you enjoy them.
I definitely will, I think. So everyone, remember, I don't, well, not to be weird or anything, but this YouTube channel, I don't care if you subscribe right now, go to Man Behind the Screen, go to his newsletter over on Substack, read his work, subscribe to him, because he honestly rocks.
And don't forget to read and subscribe to him.
Some more. So until next time, toodles, everyone.
Have a good